Fromland is a place full of many mysteries and even more questions than either of us could have possibly expected as we were starting to watch it. But Victor himself is arguably the most interesting thing in the entire show because the amount of seemingly impossible things that he does time and time again make it seem as if Victor himself is almost inhuman in one way or another. And the massacre, oh man, the massacre that happened in Victor's backstory is becoming more intriguing as the series goes by and becomes longer and longer. Ever since we first learned about the massacre through Victor's flashbacks, I've been incredibly curious to know what exactly happened that got so many people killed that day, and even more importantly than that, I've seriously wanted to know who was the person that made it happen, who was the person responsible for the massacre. Victor, of course, as always, is the main suspect. Him surviving 40 years in Fromland has always been incredibly suspicious, and there's a list of other things about him that make it obvious that there's definitely a lot about Victor that we as the viewers do not know. 40 years without a talisman, magically surviving days in the monster's underground lair, and him being the only survivor of the massacre itself, it just makes sense to suspect Victor as there's so much evidence that he may not be what he appears to be. The most interesting thing about this massacre is that throughout the show we've been getting hints constantly that the massacre is some type of significant event. We've been getting signs constantly that the massacre is more than just a really big loss for the human side. The writers are clearly implying that the massacre holds a lot of importance in the world of Fromland itself, and we know that mostly because of Victor. In the first season, it was obvious that Victor somehow knew that a new massacre was going to happen once again, and it was a large part of his arc in that season. Like that scene of him looking at the drawings of the original massacre that happened back in the day, it's obvious that Victor got the feeling that it was going to happen again, and when Victor helps Julie escape the colony house invasion by the monsters, he tells her to go into the faraway tree so she could be teleported to a different place because the boy in white told him to do that. But before Victor sends Julie into the tree, he says to her, "Tell Ethan that it's starting." More than likely, Victor was talking about a new massacre.
Wait!
There's another one here.
Another what?
You're to get inside.
The tree? No!
You'll be safe.
What?
You have to find your brother. You have to warn him. You have to tell him it's
I
starting.
don't know what you're talking about.
Go!
The massacre itself seems to be a sort of paradigm shift in the town, a sort of wiping the slate clean and doing a restart on the From town itself. I'm definitely of the belief that the massacre represents a sort of end to a cycle in Fromland and the beginning of a new one. Victor being the only survivor of the massacre makes it seem like he was somehow responsible for it, and that possibly the monsters allowed him to live because of what he helped them do that night. And because Victor suffers from so much memory loss after the massacre, he himself might not even remember that he actually helped the monsters during the act itself, but maybe there was another reason for his survival. The boy in white's involvement in the massacre itself is basically impossible to explain or talk about, but him being so happy after the massacre makes it clear that the boy was very happy about whatever it was that was taking place that night of the massacre. I mean, just look how happy he looks. Look at that boy. If that isn't suspicious, then nothing is. In the entire story, the boy's motivations remain a mystery up to now as we're going into the third season. We still don't know what his real intentions for the people of this town actually is and what he wants from the townspeople. We know that the boy in white has telepathy and can communicate with people in their minds, but maybe he also has the ability to wipe people's memories using that same telepathic ability. Victor's memory loss has always been such a mystery to me because it's obvious there's more going on there than just simply trauma. And the leading theory for Eloise, who is Victor's sister is that she somehow managed to jump out the lighthouse, so she was pushed off by the boy and made it to the same place that Tabitha ended up after the end of season 2. And at the end of season 1, the boy in white stopped Boyd and Sarah from making it to the lighthouse, so he prevented them from seemingly leaving Fromland. And we know that the entity loves to manipulate the people of this town. He loves playing with their emotions and using apparitions to get them to do what he wants. Remember, the boy in white was also the one who sent Boyd to get infected by the worms, the same worms that ended up becoming the cicadas. So the boy in white may have just been the demon in disguise all along. That smile he had after hundreds of people had been dragged out of their hiding spots, brutally slaughtered and massacred in the streets is absolutely disgusting. And this one scene definitely makes the boy seem an evil entity. Those numbers that Tabitha saw on the lighthouse definitely seem to be representations of years of significance in the world of Fromland itself, so the theory that each of those numbers is a year where a massacre took place is definitely one of my favorite theories in this entire show. When Boyd and Sarah came across the bottle tree, they ended up finding a bottle with the year 1864 written on it, and that's just further proof that the numbers written on the lighthouse are probably meant to represent years of great events that happened in the town. I'd also like to point out that the year 1978 is also written down, and that's probably the year Victor himself entered Fromland. So 1978 being written down as the year of a massacre would make a lot of sense, because we know that one happened in Victor's backstory. But this aspect of manipulation of a townsperson being the reason behind the massacre is interesting to consider, especially when we start talking about Christopher, the man who Jade found a picture of in the book. Christopher, as it is right now in the story, is a man full of mystery. His origin, his motivations, heck, we don't even know if he's dead or alive. Everything about this man is a mystery, except for one thing, that he used to see the same symbol that Jade has been seeing ever since he first entered this cursed Fromland. But what is this symbol to begin with? What does it signify? What we do know is that the symbol is closely tied to a ritual that once took place in Fromland, seemingly in the underground tunnels that the monsters now seem to be dwelling in. But Ethan, with his great wisdom and abundant knowledge, told us something very, very powerful, and something we should definitely consider not only in Fromland, but also in life.
Symbols are important, especially on a quest.
Yeah?
But you have to figure out if they're good symbols or bad symbols.
What do you mean bad symbols?
Sometimes it would make you do bad things.
Ethan's comments make sense because the meaning of the symbol itself is a mystery. It could have been the very thing that made Christopher susceptible. It could have been the very thing that allowed the entity to convince him against his own people. And so, it's no wonder that Jade being responsible for the next wipeout is something lots of people are theorizing in the Fromunity. We know almost nothing about Christopher. The little that we do know comes from Victor. And Victor said everyone liked Christopher and that he was able to make people laugh, which was something hard to do in a From town that had no talismans and a constant fear of being tortured by demons. But why would someone supposedly so kind-hearted and beloved turn against his own community? Perhaps he never betrayed them to begin with. Maybe he himself was deceived. The voices that talk to Sarah have always been such a strong and interesting plot point for me ever since the very first season. Even now, they're definitely high up on my list of mysteries that I need answers for. It's possible that just like Sarah was convinced to kill Jade's friend Toby and convinced to kill Ethan under the guise of getting everyone home, maybe Christopher himself was also under the assumption that the things he was doing were going to somehow allow the people of the town to go home. Before Boyd ended up taking her out, Abby was 100% sure that dying was the way to get out of Fromland. Christopher could have been told something similar by the voices, and so he revealed the hiding spots of all the residents to the monsters, thinking that it was going to somehow allow them to go home. But there's something the voices said to Sarah that may have massive implications in the story. The voices told her that bad things happened the last time two cars came into Fromland at the same time, the same way Jade's car and the Matthews RV did in the very first episode.
They said it happened before, that two cars came on the same day and everyone died. They said it was because of the people in the cars. They said they wanted to help and they'd been waiting for someone to come. Someone who could help them escape, help them go home.
This implies that stopping the massacre is somehow crucial to going home, that managing to stop it will allow the residents to be able to return back to the human world. If that was really the entity laughing after the massacre, maybe stopping it prevents the entity from being fed for another cycle, and that might make him weak enough that the residents may be able to just leave Fromland entirely when he hasn't been fed, when he lacks the magic to make a new cycle of Fromland. But there's another theory to explain what happened that night. Victor's mom, as it is right now, seems to be dead. Victor directly said that he found her at the bottle tree that leads to the lighthouse. This of course makes sense, as the last time we saw her, she said she was going to save the children who are supposedly trapped in the lighthouse. But one thing that's never addressed is that Victor's sister Eloise left the cellar trying to follow her, but because Eloise's body has never been found, she likely made it to the lighthouse itself and was probably pushed out by the boy, just like what happened to Tabitha. There's an interesting theory by Taran Matharu that the reason Victor survived the massacre and has survived as long as he has is because Victor's mother herself made a deal with the entity to reveal the hiding spots of the humans in exchange for Victor's life to be spared. This would explain what happened that night at the massacre, and even explains how Victor survived as long as he has in Fromland, because the monsters have been leaving him alone on purpose. But Victor's mother also supposedly has the same bracelet that Tabitha made for Jim Matthews almost 2 decades ago. But how could that be possible if Victor's mother died like 40 years ago from the current story? Of course, that's where the time travel theory comes in. We know that teleportation exists in Fromland due to the faraway trees, but is time travel also possible? One of the biggest clues about time travel is when Boyd goes into the dungeon for the first time and meets Martin. Considering Martin seems to have been fighting in the Civil War due to his tattoo, as well as his confusion about whether what Boyd was holding was actually a gun, there's some slight hints that Boyd may have actually traveled back in time when he entered the tree, and when he exits the dungeon, the building itself completely disappears. If this is time travel, then it makes sense. The building existed back then, but it doesn't exist in the current time because it's been destroyed over the decades and decades since Martin was in the dungeon. If time travel does exist in the From universe, then the bracelet might literally be the same exact bracelet that Tabitha made way back then, and she or someone else ends up giving it to Victor's mom after they travel back in time. I also want to touch upon the voice on the radio that was talking to Jim Matthews. This voice at first seemed to have been a hostile voice, but when you think about it, nothing he said was actually a threat. In fact, it could be looked at as a warning from a certain point of view, warning Jim that their attempts at getting answers and leaving will lead to a sort of escalation from Fromland in response. This voice could have been Christopher all along. We still don't know where or who this voice actually is. Of course, the assumption is that it was the entity, but it could have easily been Christopher from somewhere out in Fromland, living in isolation and exile because of shame from his actions that led to a couple hundred bodies getting dropped overnight. But looking at all of these possibilities, and I'm sure that you have some that are completely different to mine, it's definitely fair to say that the writers so far want us to think of Christopher as being the one who was responsible for what happened that night in Fromville. Christopher has definitely been getting hinted at as being the one whose actions resulted in those people getting killed, and Victor's mom telling him to hide somewhere Christopher doesn't know just makes Christopher seem that much more suspicious and as being the person likely responsible for the massacre. This town has a way of making people do things you could never have expected from them in any way. From Abby shooting up dozens of people and Sarah almost killing the boy, we know life in this town can easily turn you into something you never imagined possible. With the season 3 coming up, maybe we'll get some answers on the massacre, but one thing I've been wondering about this town in general is whether it even exists in the real world to begin with. The ever-shifting trees, for example, leave me with a lot of questions about how this town and Fromland in general works. So watch my video about whether the town actually exists or not, because knowing the answer to this question will be very relevant now that Tabitha has seemingly made it to the real world.